Um, Welcome, everybody. That you're here. I sent emails out a couple of times that has information about other presentations and toolkits that the league has. And, please, in one action alert, please go check those out if you haven't. Um, Also, please mute yourself and please mostly hold your questions till the end. There's a chat function. You can put questions there and we'll try to check it, but it works a little bit easier otherwise. I am going to introduce Christina Schlitt and she'll introduce Marcelo Betti. Um, Christina Schlitt has been with the league, I'm not sure how long, but she's been, she's past president of the state league and she's done a little bit of everything, probably a lot of everything here and there. And she has worked under the auspices of the DEI group to bring in Marcelo to do this presentation on immigration for us. So, Christina, if you would like to take it.
Thank you, Carla. Appreciate it. I'd like to introduce Marcelo Betti. He's the legal director at the Immigration Justice of Michigan. And Marcelo has been practicing immigration law with a family and humanitarian focus since 2014. He is a graduate of Vermont Law School, Grand Valley State University, and Northwestern Michigan College. Marcelo has been working at the Traverse City office since 2015. He speaks Portuguese and Spanish, and I'd like to quote, "As an immigrant myself, I find it fulfilling to help clients navigate a complex bureaucracy so that they can best contribute to our communities. I also firmly believe that immigrants are the essence of what makes the United States special." Please welcome Marcelo Betti. Marcelo?
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for having me. Good evening, everyone. Um, yes, I have been practicing immigration law for over 10 years since the end of the second Obama administration. So I can tell you that I've seen some, drastic shifts in immigration policy since then. Um, Before I really get started, I should remind everyone that the information that I'm going to be sharing tonight should not be taken as legal advice. I know you always hear attorneys say that at these types of presentations, but this is especially true in the context of immigration because this is a very fact-specific area of law. I can meet with two clients whose situation is 99% identical, but a single difference could lead to completely different immigration options or results. So especially at the end when we open up for questions, please understand that I'm not going to be able to give you any case specific advice. Okay. So thanks for understanding that. Well, I was invited to speak to you tonight about immigration issues affecting our country, including what's going on right here in Michigan. So let me give you a little bit of background first, even before we get to the Constitution. So Michigan is home to over 700,000 immigrants, meaning people who were born outside of the United States. About half of that population are naturalized U.S. citizens. And then on the other hand, approximately 110,000 are undocumented. More than 10% of business owners in Michigan are immigrants. Approximately 30% of physicians in the state of Michigan are foreign born. And the same goes for more than 20% of mechanical engineers. And then I always like to share the top 5 countries of origin for immigrants living in Michigan are Mexico, India, Iraq, Canada, and China. Now, my office is here in Traverse City. And if you've been to Traverse City, you probably know that our region is not particularly known for its cultural diversity. But we have kept track of the nationalities of clients that we've represented over the years. And last time we checked, we had helped individuals from more than 70 different countries. That's about a third of the world's countries right here through our Little Traverse City office. Anyway, so that's just to set the scene. But for tonight, there are any number of places where we could start when we want to talk about immigration. Being a lawyer, I naturally think it's a good idea to start with the supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. So there we go. Slide number 2. So I bring up the Constitution for several reasons, right? So the first one is because I believe, or I'd like to believe, that the U.S. Constitution is something in which Americans can find common ground despite their political preferences or affiliations, right? So that's why I find it disheartening when I read things online to the tune of, well, if you're in the country illegally, then you shouldn't have any constitutional rights, right? If you feel that way and the Constitution protects your right to have that opinion, then the course of action is for you to contact your congressional representatives and tell them that you would like to change what the Constitution says. You would like to amend the Constitution, because that would be the only way to legally deprive anyone of the rights that they currently have, right? So the people who wrote the Constitution were very, very intentional about the words that they used, right? So there are sections of the Constitution that refer to citizens of the United States, and then there are other sections that refer to persons, which is clearly a broader category that includes both citizens and non-citizens, right? So these words have real meaning. So before we delve into what's happening to immigrants in the United States today, I think it's important for us to remember, or learn what these constitutional rights are that they have. And even before then, we should remember why those rights exist in the first place and why it's important for them to continue to exist and to be respected, right? We really need to break this down to a very granular level. So then first, the basics, what is a constitution, right? Well, it's a set of fundamental principles or rules that govern how a country operates, right? And it also outlines the certain rights that the people that are being governed actually have. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So why did we, the United States of America, need a constitution? Well, I'm not going to recap the entire War of Independence, but I do think as a starting point, we should think about what happened right after the U.S. became an independent nation, right? So we kicked the British out. Now what do? You may remember from your civics classes, if you were not sleeping through them in high school, that the first attempt to organize a national government was not the Constitution, right? It was the Articles of Confederation, and they did not work, right? And the reason they didn't work, their main flaw was that they created a central government that was just too weak to effectively address national defense and disputes between the states, right? So the U.S. Constitution was actually the second crack at it, where the framers created a federal government that was powerful enough to act on a federal national level, while also protecting states' rights and the fundamental rights of individual persons, right? So the framers were very worried about how can we prevent abuse of power by the government against its own people, right? So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we got the basics out of the way. So now let's talk about some of these fundamental rights that the Constitution guarantees and also to whom they are guaranteed, right? So I'm not going to go through every single one, but let's go through a few examples. First example, the Fourth Amendment, right? So the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. Also, it talks about how no warrants can be issued unless you have probable cause. And those warrants have to particularly describe the place to be searched or the persons or things to be seized. Again, so I want to really highlight, the word people and the word persons. That's what this amendment is about. There's a lot of good stuff there. So let's look at another one. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so here is the Fifth Amendment. We have a lot of things. We have the right to a grand jury if you're accused of a serious crime. We have the double jeopardy clause, and then of course we have protections against self-incrimination, right? The pleading the fifth, and the right to due process, and we even have the takings clause at the end. I like it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now we're going to jump all the way ahead to the 14th Amendment, because again, we're not reviewing the entire Constitution. Now we're beyond the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and we're into the Civil War era, the 1860s. The 14th Amendment is actually quite long, so we're going to focus just on Section 1. And Section 1 says that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. Okay, it also talks about how states cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, so the 14th Amendment is very relevant to what is happening today, including because this is where we find the birthright citizenship clause. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's relevant because it's an example that encapsulates what's happening to immigrant rights under the current administration, right? So when the president took office January 20th of last year, he issued a number of executive orders related to immigration policy. And the one that caught the most media attention was an executive order that purported to limit birthright citizenship. So basically, the order stated that babies born in the United States are not U.S. citizens if their mother is either undocumented or only has temporary legal status, and the father is not a green card holder or a U.S. citizen. Well, we can look at what the Constitution says, right? Section 1 clearly states that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. So the administration has a legal argument that a mother who is here on a temporary status or without status is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, just about anyone with a law degree who reads the executive order knows that it's blatantly unconstitutional, right? And the only reason I qualify that statement, I say law degree, is because most of us are not just walking around talking about jurisdiction on a regular basis, right? But the meaning of that word is actually relatively simple. Jurisdiction is the power, that the government has, sometimes that a court has, to make legal decisions over a person or a type of case, right? So if it was true, as the executive order says, that those mothers are not subject to U.S. jurisdiction, then I don't know how the justice system, could have the power to decide whether they can be deported or not, whether they can be detained or not, which is clearly a power that the U.S. government has, right? So that's why several federal courts have ruled that this executive order is unconstitutional. I think every single one of them who have faced this issue ruled and said it's unconstitutional. Of course, we do have Supreme Court arguments coming up sometime this spring. We'll see what they say. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. So after this quick review of a few sections of the Constitution, what have we learned? Well, we learned that all people in the United States have certain constitutional rights, regardless of their immigration status, right? If the Constitution says people, then it covers citizens and non-citizens alike. Now, absolutely, there are certain constitutional rights that do not apply to non-citizens, okay? The right to vote, for example, is only available to U.S. citizens. So yes, there are definitely differences in the protections and the rights that the Constitution extends to citizens versus non-citizens, okay? There are also differences in the rights available to individuals who are facing deportation proceedings, okay? Those are technically called removal, but I'm going to call them deportation because it's just more readily understood. And I didn't cover this during my mini civics lesson, but most of you probably know that if a person is accused of a crime, then the Sixth Amendment guarantees that person the right to an attorney for their defense, right? And in the 1960s and 1970s, there were a couple of Supreme Court decisions that interpreted that amendment and determined that it requires the government to provide legal counsel for indigents free of charge if the crime that the person is accused of could result in imprisonment. Okay, so does that mean that the government has an obligation to provide a free lawyer to a poor immigrant who is in detention? And the answer is actually no. Okay, and the reason for that is because the right to an attorney under the Sixth Amendment applies only to criminal proceedings. Okay, and the reason that's important here is because deportation proceedings in immigration court are not criminal proceedings. Okay, most violations of immigration law are not a crime. Being present in the United States without permission is not a crime. Overstaying a visa is not a crime. Okay, so on one hand, that sounds good, right? Except it also means that when a non-citizen is detained and placed in deportation proceedings, and the government does not have to pay for an attorney to represent them. Okay, so the Sixth Amendment is actually not relevant here because most immigration violations are just civil infractions. They're like parking tickets, but with just horrific, life-changing consequences, right? So it is important to note, right, that the Fifth Amendment still applies, due process, because detention and deportation are things that deprive a person of their liberty, right? There's a liberty interest here. And under the Fifth Amendment, the government can't do that without affording that person due process of law. And then in the immigration context, due process includes the right to hire an attorney to represent you in immigration court. It's just that the government is not going to pay for it. So this is one of the many tricky things about constitutional law and immigration law, right? The Constitution doesn't really define what due process means. Instead, what we have is over the centuries, our judiciary, our courts have ruled that the process that is due will depend on the specific situation that a person finds themselves in, right? But the one thing that we do know is there needs to be a process that allows any person who is being deprived of life, liberty, or property the opportunity to defend themselves. Okay, that's why the government cannot arrest anyone, put them on a plane to another country without affording that person the right to contact an attorney or explain why they fear being returned to that country, right? The government also cannot deport anyone without explaining the reason why they're being deported. The government has to specify what section of law makes that person deportable. Okay, so it's probably true to say that yes, people in deportation proceedings have fewer rights. You know, they don't have a right to a free lawyer, but they don't have zero rights. Okay, and again, why is that? Because they are people who are physically present in the United States of America. And like I said before, anyone who doesn't like that can go, start a campaign for a constitutional amendment. Okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide and finally, get back to the present. One thing that's happening today is a quick degradation of immigrants' rights. Christina, can you go to the next slide, please? I don't remember exactly what
Yes,
that one.
Yes,
there we go.
I'm trying to.
You're fighting the technology.
Yep. I might have to bring it back up. So
That's okay.
Just continue.
Right, I'm going to keep going. All right. So I'm going to bring us back to the present and what's happening to immigrants' rights. So we're seeing a federal government that is actively disregarding the constitutional rights of non-citizens under the guise of national security or common sense, right? Whether it's by revoking visas, detaining, or deporting people because of their political opinion, their exercise of their First Amendment rights, or arbitrarily determining that most immigrants who are not lawfully present in the United States are subject to mandatory detention without the right to bond. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, overall, we are seeing a government that is eagerly and actively working to suspend or ignore the rights of the people. Okay. So I already talked about the executive order that attempts to restrict birthright citizenship. And again, fortunately, that hasn't worked out too well so far. But let's set aside the constitutional theory for a second and let's look at other measures that this administration has taken in order to limit immigrants' rights. And these are measures or policy decisions that are not directly related to the Constitution and they have more to do with the country's immigration laws, right? The rights or privileges that immigrants have enjoyed because of laws passed by Congress or through executive action, right? So one thing that's easy to forget and perhaps hard to understand is how come the president, the executive branch, has so much control over immigration law, right? We know that it's Congress that makes the laws, but Congress is not out there passing laws left and right. To the contrary, so over the past year, there's been one single congressional amendment to our immigration laws, the Laken-Riley Act. Yet there have been hundreds of changes in how the executive branch has enforced or applied our immigration laws. And the reason for this, for this whiplash that immigrants and advocates feel every time a different party takes over the White House, is because the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, our main immigration statute, the INA grants a great amount of discretion to the executive branch, to the president, to decide how our immigration laws should be enforced. Okay, if you read the INA, you will see everywhere that the Attorney General, part of the executive branch, gets to decide how to implement this or that language contained in the law. In fact, the executive branch has so much power over immigration law that the entire immigration court system, the immigration judges who decide whether or not to deport someone, and also the Board of Immigration Appeals, the BIA, which, as the name indicates, hears any appeals of decisions made by those lower court judges. That entire immigration court system is actually part of the Department of Justice, which in turn is part of the executive branch. Okay, so I want to let that sink in for a minute, okay? Because 99% of the time when you're reading or hearing or watching a news story about some court decision, or perhaps about an argument before the Supreme Court, that story is about the judiciary branch of government, right? I don't have another civics lesson plan for this part, but you know this already, right? Checks and balances. The legislative branch makes laws, the judiciary interprets them, the executive enforces them. That's the system that the founding fathers envisioned. And yet, the entire immigration court system somehow exists separately from the judiciary branch. Okay, so just imagine that you are a non-citizen, you're an immigrant who has been detained and placed in removal proceedings, in deportation proceedings, and then you show up to your hearing. Hopefully you have hired legal counsel or found someone to represent you for free, because in that courtroom, there will be another lawyer representing the government. Okay, it's basically a prosecutor who is going to be arguing for your deportation. Well, who does that other lawyer work for? Who's their boss? Well, it's the person who runs the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, who is appointed by the president, right? Now, in that same courtroom, right in front of you, there will be an immigration judge. And the judge is the person who is going to decide whether or not you should be deported. There's no right to a jury trial in immigration court, right? Because these are civil proceedings, not criminal cases. So your judge is right there. And who does that judge work for, right? Who is their boss? Well, it's the head of the Department of Justice. It's the Attorney General appointed by the president. Okay. This is problematic. Now, does that mean that immigration judges are biased or partial or corrupt? Not necessarily, but it is their job, right? A job that they probably want to keep, and a job that may be at risk if their boss is unhappy with their decisions. Okay, if there's a pattern of decisions that don't align with the administration's policies, right? So you have probably seen in the news that the Department of Justice has fired dozens and dozens of immigration judges across the country, even though, as things were, immigration courts are overburdened with the number of cases that they have before them, right? I read somewhere that the U.S. started 2026 with fewer than half the immigration judges from a year ago. I couldn't, find the perfect source for this, but either way, we know that we started the year with like many fewer immigration judges than we had when this administration took office. So, as you can see, even though the Constitution assigns to Congress the power to make laws regarding immigration, Congress has basically given the executive branch carte blanche, pardon my French, literally, a license, a blank check, to reshape immigration policy, right? Okay, let's go to the next slide, because this is one of the many reasons, why voting is so important. Why it's important for voters to know and understand who they are electing. And obviously, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. The importance of voting. But it's also why it's upsetting to many voters that they were told that this administration would work hard to detain and deport criminals, right? The worst of the worst. And then to see who is actually being arrested and detained and deported, right? So the most recent data that I could find from early January says that there are almost 70,000 people currently in immigration detention in the United States. More than a third of them, around 25,000, have no criminal record whatsoever. No convictions, not even any charges pending against them. Another 16,000 or so are facing criminal charges, but they have not been convicted, right? Innocent until proven guilty. And then in Michigan, the difference is even starker. More than half of the 3,000 plus immigrants who are detained in Michigan have no criminal conviction or even pending charges, right? So that tells us that the people who are being held in detention facilities, like the one that we have in Baldwin, Michigan, which has 1,800 beds and is one of the top 10 biggest ICE detention facilities in the country, the people detained there are not the worst of the worst. In fact, these facilities basically acknowledge this by having detainees wear a color-coded clothing. So in Baldwin, for example, the low security detainees wear blue, the high level security detainees wear red, and people in between wear orange, right? So they know, okay, who's being detained. Okay, so here's a thought, right? So we know that whenever a person is arrested for a non-serious crime, let's say petty theft, right? You stole some razors from the grocery store. Well, that person can usually pay a bond so they can be free while they wait for their criminal case to proceed. So if more than 1/3 of the people, or more than one half in Michigan, if the people in detention have no criminal record, they have not even been accused of a crime, why are they even being detained, right? Why are they not able to at least post bond while they wait for their deportation case to be heard? Why is it that the government is detaining so many people? Why would you arrest a 5-year-old and keep them detained for several days? Well, so this is one of those things where there's a reason, and then there's a more cynical reason. Okay, so I'm going to start with the latter, right? So I do have sources for this. I don't know if we can. I can maybe share that with Christina afterwards, but and she can disseminate. But roughly 90% of the total population in immigration detention are being held in facilities that are operated by private for-profit companies. Okay, companies that have donated over $1 million to a certain candidate's presidential campaign. Okay. Some of these companies actually saw their stock go up 75% within days of the 2024 election. Now, I'm not a financial advisor, but depending on how you feel about karma and morality, there might be a moneymaker there for you. But let's go back to the question. Okay, so other than seeking profit, how can you legally justify indefinitely detaining people who have no criminal record, right? And the answer is actually one of the most, in my opinion, underrated or undercovered policy changes that this administration has made. Remember earlier when I was talking about the immigration court system, how we have the lower level immigration judges, and then if there's an appeal, it goes to the Board of Immigration Appeals, the BIA. So in early 2025, when the administration took office, the BIA was composed of 28 judges, right? Now, the BIA is not like the Supreme Court, where all the judges hear all the cases. They're all sitting in the same room. Can't do that with 28 judges, right? So instead, every time a case gets appealed to the BIA, it gets assigned to a 3-judge panel. In less than 1 month after taking office, this administration fired 9 of the 28 judges, and all 9 have been appointed by the previous administration. Okay, so the result, which presumably was exactly the plan, is that since then, the BIA has been issuing decision after decision that is in line with the current administration's immigration policies. Okay. Over the past year, I have come to fear the BIA news drop that comes into my email inbox basically every Friday, announcing some new, awful, unfair presidential decision that has just become the norm. Okay. For example, we've seen the BIA do a lot of damage to the rights of asylum seekers. There's a recent decision from maybe a couple months ago that said that for an asylum applicant, right, to prove that they were persecuted in the past, it's not enough to say that they received a death threat. Okay, instead, the applicant has to prove that the person who made the death threat actually had the means to carry out that threat. Okay, how are you supposed to do that, right? Are you supposed to ask the person who threatened you to show you their gun collection, right? So that's just one example of a bad decision. And like I said, these have been coming every week, basically. So anyways, we were talking about how it's possible for the government to indefinitely detain people, right, who have no criminal record without even giving them the right to get out on bond. Well, the BIA has a decision for that, okay? And they went against more than 30 years of precedent and decided late last year to reinterpret the language of the immigration law that gives the government the power to detain people who are suspected of immigration violations. So specifically, the BIA decided, and they used some legal acrobatics, they decided that any undocumented immigrant, any undocumented non-citizen who entered the country without inspection, even if that entry happened 30 years ago, even if the immigrant has a clean criminal record the entire time, even if they're married to a U.S. citizen and have U.S. citizen children, if that immigrant, if that non-citizen is detained by immigration authorities, they are subject to mandatory detention without the right to bond. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into the minutia of this decision. It suffices to say that it goes directly against how the law has been interpreted and applied for the last 30 years or so. But I thought this was an important one to mention because it gave the government the power, the ability to keep far more people detained than ever before. Okay. And again, the cynical part of my brain, is going to say that it's to feed the private prison complex that is being funded by everyone's tax dollars, right? Anyway, so that brings me to the last point before we go into Q&A. We can go to the next slide. Oh yeah, that was the slide that I was talking about. But you see the money. You can follow the money. We can go to the next one. All right, so reasonable people can definitely disagree on immigration issues, right? I don't think it's inherently a problem for politicians or people in general to argue that the country may be better off if immigration increases or decreases, right? People can wonder whether Congress should come up with a different immigration system with different laws that would determine who or how many people should be able to immigrate to the United States, right? This is all fine. Also, are there people in immigration detention right now and in deportation proceedings who perhaps are dangerous and should be removed? Absolutely, right? But are there also people there who have no criminal record, but they are present in the country in violation of our immigration laws and who have no viable legal claim to remain in the country, and therefore, even though they have, by and large, been hardworking, law-abiding non-citizens, but they might have no options and be subject to deportation? Yes, absolutely. Okay, based on the laws that we have. So you might think that's really unfair, right? If the only thing that someone did wrong was, maybe they overstayed a visa, but other than that, they've tried their hardest to follow the law. Is it unfair that they could be subject to deportation? Perhaps, but that might be what the law says. Okay, so I think it'd be important for us to kind of start thinking about this and wonder, should there be a way to allow a non-citizen who has been living in the United States for decades, perhaps, should they be allowed to fix their legal status based on, I don't know, good behavior, contribution to society, payment of taxes, regardless of how they enter the country? Perhaps they have to pay a fine or a tax to make up for their past immigration infractions. Probably. Right. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we don't have to be stuck with our current laws. Okay. The Constitution assigns to Congress the responsibility and the power to devise our immigration laws. And if we as a nation, if we as voters want to see a change in the immigration process, then it should be through a reform of our current immigration laws. It should be through Congress doing its job and improving what is clearly a broken and unfair immigration system, right? The INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, okay, the main law that governs immigration in the U.S., It was enacted in 1965. Okay. The last major change in that law was passed in 1996. That was 30 years ago. We all looked very different 30 years ago. Okay. The United States is a very different place now compared to what it was in 1996. Now, Congress would still need the president to sign any bills into law, but it would be nice to see Congress at least try, right? For example, Congress could create a bill to provide a path to legal status to dreamers, right? People who were brought into the United States as minor children before 2007. That's the legal definition. They could create a path to Afghan allies who were evacuated when Kabul fell to the Taliban in 2021. They could provide permanent relief to Ukrainians who fled after Russia invaded and sought refuge here in the United States. But we just haven't seen any real effort by Congress to help immigrants, right? Now, Congress could also go the other way and reform our immigration laws and make them stricter, right? They could make immigration to the United States much more difficult. But we haven't even seen that either. Okay. All we've seen is Congress deferring to the executive branch, basically abdicating their constitutional duties and then letting the executive run amok, right? So that's why, again, every time a new party takes over the White House, we have that whiplash in immigration policy, and that's why we have an emboldened executive branch that is just happy to disregard people's constitutional rights in order to advance their vision of who gets to immigrate to the US. So, what can we do, right? Well, this, here out of all groups knows best. You can engage in the political process, right? You can start by calling your congressional representatives. You can call your senators. You can let them know that you would like to see a fairer immigration system. Maybe you would like to see an end to government violence in immigration enforcement. You can tell them to oppose any further funding increases to ICE and to privately owned detention facilities. Okay. That is absolutely an important piece of the puzzle. Also, don't get arrested. Okay. You need to be available and able to vote in the upcoming midterm elections, right? We're living in really difficult times, and you may feel that our society, the fabric of our nation, is at a breaking point. But I would strongly advise people against doing anything too rash at this point. Okay. I know that I've had a lot of people who have contacted me and asked, hey, I may have like an apartment or a house where I can, provide a home or shelter for undocumented immigrants. And I'm like, you don't want to be in violation of harboring and sheltering laws. Okay. Like, so just please be careful out there. All right. What else can you do? Help register people to vote. Okay. I have a kind of a sad story. Last election, night before the election, I was going door to door, basically providing some moral support to a friend who was canvassing. And I contacted a young person I know whose parents are undocumented, but this person is a U.S. citizen. And I just wanted to remind her, and let her know, hey, are you voting tomorrow? Do you need a ride to the polls? And, even though this person is in Michigan, right, a swing state, even though their parents are very vulnerable, they were like, I'm not going to vote. My vote doesn't matter, right? Those people are still out there, even though their vote absolutely matters, especially in Michigan, right? And then last but not least, this is kind of I'm just trying to be creative here. Consider becoming a volunteer poll worker or election observer, right? Every polling location in the country is going to need observers to protect against, or at least document, interference and voter intimidation. There are people in all levels of state government right now who are very worried about possible interference by the federal government in how elections are conducted this fall. So we need to do everything that we can, not only to make sure the votes are correctly counted, but also to prevent voter suppression. Okay. All right. Well, let's open up for questions.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I was muted and I didn't realize it. So, couple of things. First of all, thank you very much, Marcelo Betty. That was wonderful. I really appreciate the constitutional underpinnings of what's going on. So we're going to have people. I've got one question in the chat already. So while you're thinking about questions, you can either raise your hand using the React function, which has a raise hand thing under it, or you can, put something in the chat. But while we're here and you're thinking about that, we have one person identified as Zoom user guest and no video, so we have no idea who you are. And I would like to invite you to unmute and identify yourself, or give us a picture of you. So, and
Sorry,
Okay.
my name is Terry.
oh, okay.
What league are you with, Terry?
Berrien County, Michigan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question which came up in the chat was, even if Congress changes laws, could the executive branch still override these executive level policies?
Well, there are two things, right? The first thing is the law has to be signed, right? So the first thing that the president could do is just veto whatever shows up in their desk, right? But hypothetically, big picture here, let's say that perhaps not during this administration, but during the next administration, Congress enacts a different system for immigration, right? That completely reform the immigration system. Well, perhaps by not assigning too much control, expressly in to the executive branch in the law, that would be a good start, right? Perhaps by making sure that the immigration court system should be part of the judiciary branch of government and not part of the executive branch of government. So there are ways that you could phrase things in the law in order to maybe rein in executive power a little bit. Now, the history of United States, there's at least legally speaking, is kind of that push and pull between the powers. The presidency wanted to do. I mean, Marbury v. Madison, right? The first famous Supreme Court decision was basically the Supreme Court saying, "Hey, we have some power too." So I think that yes, there would be ways that you could do that. It's just that right now, with the way that the law is written, there's just way too much in the hands of the executive.
Okay. So, Christina, do you want to?
I'll watch the chat and you call on the people with raised hands.
Okay, that'll work. Christine Allen.
Okay, thank you. And I think he just answered my question, because my question was, the immigration courts are under or not under the judiciary, but that sounds like it's by law, not constitution. So a law could change that.
Yes.
That level. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
In fact, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, that has been one of their main causes, of advocacy over the past few years.
Okay.
I think that you can see the conflict of interest, right?
Yeah, totally.
It's very clear. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Christine. This next question comes from Linda Pell. Linda?
Hi, sorry. So I'm from Calhoun County,
And Calhoun County Jail has been a detention facility for immigrants for over 30 years. A group of us have been working to get a meeting with the sheriff to express our concerns. We have 17 community organizations who have signed on to this letter. And today he agreed to set up several meetings to accommodate us and to answer questions. And I've already spoken to him. So he does talk about some of the same things that you shared. But I guess we have concerns about making sure that the immigrants who are detained in our county jail are treated fairly, have health care, access to all the rights that they have. And I guess my question to you is are there any specific things that you think we should query the sheriff on to make sure that people are just being treated fairly?
Yeah,
He
that-
doesn't have an option about who's in his jail,
right.
but he does have some control over how they're treated while they're there.
Yeah, it's a tough question, right? I think that because they're basically contracting, it's not just Calhoun, Chippewa County Jail, I think Monroe, so there are some county jails that have contracts with the Department of Homeland Security. And without looking at the fine print, of those agreements, I cannot tell you how much of control, the local government, or the sheriff would have over the detainees. I think that at the absolute minimum, there needs to be ease of access for attorneys to meet with the detainees, right? There is the having access to legal counsel is pretty essential for folks who are detained. So I think that would probably be like the biggest one. But yeah, when it comes to like the more detailed stuff, like health care, like that's I like that you're thinking creatively, and doing that, but I don't know how much of it is going to be within the sheriff's control, which is probably why it's a good idea to have that meeting, because you might learn a lot more about what the agreement looks like and what they can offer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Annie Weaver. She says, "Thank you for a great presentation. I'm with the Livingston County League. I work with college students at the University of Michigan, and we are dealing with a lot of fear." Care to comment, Marcelo?
Yeah, well, I think it's tough. I think that we have seen some pretty high profile cases of non-citizens who are here on student visas, who had their status revoked or are being placed in removal proceedings because of the opinions that they have expressed, right? I mentioned that earlier, because they're basically exercising their First Amendment rights. And I think that that's where things get really complicated, because the argument that the administration makes is, if you're doing a pro-Palestine if you're organizing a pro-Palestine protest, then you are being anti-Semitic and you're being anti-Israel, and therefore you're a danger to our national security, right? They're basically just, this is pretty similar to what we saw in the early 2000s with the Patriot Act, basically like couching, everything under this umbrella of national security, and basically limiting people's powers, and trying to detain them and deport them because of that. It's really tough, right? When you are not a citizen and you're here, especially on a temporary student visa, it's a pretty fragile, vulnerable place to be, so I recognize that they are afraid. And honestly, it pains me to say that, but I generally advise, clients who I have in that scenario to really refrain from expressing their opinions about these sensitive political topics, whether it's in social media or by joining protests or whatnot. I think that again, when I'm representing my clients' interests, like I have to protect them, and I mentioned, yes, immigrants have rights, but they don't have quite the same, right? There are definitely moments that things that make them more vulnerable than the average person.
Thank you. The next question is, it has been indicated that ICE will have a heavy presence at polling sites for the 2026 elections, especially in communities with high percentage of minorities. How can we prepare to offer protection for this type of intimidation? And at this point, Marcelo, I'd like to defer it to our co-president, Lynn Komansky, to highlight the Civic Action Toolkit, perhaps for league members. And then Marcelo, you can add your comments as well. Lynn?
Thanks, Christina. Yes, some of you who are familiar with Unite and Rise know that in the recent playbook for Unite and Rise, they highlighted what's called a Civic Action Toolkit. And in the Civic Action Toolkit, I believe that Carla put it in the email. Didn't you have it in there?
Yes.
Yeah, in the Civic Action Toolkit is a lot of really excellent links that you can go to find information about what local leagues can do, local league members can do. There's information about immigrant rights and knowing your rights and being careful at protests, just all sorts of things that league members should be aware of and can also be involved in. That I encourage everybody to take a look at that.
Thank you. Marcelo, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, again, this is the thing that I have, at a personal level, been the most afraid, right? It's like, are we going to have free and fair elections, or are we going to become one of those countries that we know the president doesn't like, right? So I think that I think we've seen in the news recently that the governor has already been working out on how to respond to various scenarios, right? I think that this is not going to be a surprise if it happens. Now, what exactly you as an individual can do, I think I would wait a few more months, and as we approach the election, I would be very surprised if we don't see organizations like the ACLU or that type of organization come up with a set of things that we can do to help. But like the vision that I have, of like everybody just like holding arms and creating a human chain and not letting ICE get to the to people who are waiting in line to vote, like that's probably not going to work as well, right? Because we've seen how far ICE will go, and really the intimidation is even before that, right? It's like it's going to prevent people from getting to that line in the first place, right? So that's why I mentioned, helping people register to vote, maybe helping transport people to the polls. Those are, but that's like my biggest fear, is that we'll see that these ICE operations that we've seen around the country, that there may be kind of a test drive for what we might see around election time.
Thank you. And Carla, we have one more question in the chat, if we may, before we close. Is that okay?
Yes, there's also a response from Denise Hartsow on there's a link for the Civic Action Toolkit here, and also urge people to vote early and absentee.
Yeah. Okay.
But yes, go ahead.
Thank you. One more. Thanks for an interesting presentation from Don Lenderman, Berrien County. The question is, seasonal migrant workers play an important role in Michigan agriculture and other sectors of our state economy. Are there any proposed plans to facilitate, protect migrant work in Michigan during the upcoming year? Have you heard how the current immigration crackdown is impacting farms and businesses? And that's our last question for
Yeah.
the evening. Thank you.
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time just kind of hammering how we're not seeing congressional action, that could perhaps protect migrant workers or for really anyone. One thing that I can say is during the growing season, we're here in Traverse City, right? So there are a lot of farms and whatnot. So we kind of have a little bit of a finger on the pulse of that. During the growing season, we actually did not see a lot of enforcement in our area. And what I was talking to people about through most of the summer is, I wonder if what's going to happen is that the government is waiting until harvest season, and as soon as the harvest is done, they might actually come and crack down. I don't think that there was any like massive operation, but I can tell you that November 1st was an unusually busy day. That the first week of November was unusually busy at our office, and we got a lot of calls of people saying that they had loved ones who were detained. Right. So unfortunately, I think that was about right. Right. That I think that the administration is aware that migrant labor is important. And I think that to a certain extent, they kind of laid back during the growing season. But then as soon as that was done, there were a lot of people who were detained, and then for the next season, who knows, how this is going to progress. But all we can say is that there hasn't been a change. There hasn't been anything that makes it easier for farmers to get temporary or permanent workers, migrant workers to work for them.
Yeah.
The law hasn't changed.
Thank you again. Thank you all for coming. I want to point out that Lynn added a statement at the end of the chat. MDOS, as well as democracy partner organizations, which the League is part of, are working on planning for these types of scenarios. And I believe you're talking about ISET elections, polling sites, things like that. Christina, you were going to say something?
All I was going to do was say thank you, Marcelo, and back to you, Carla.
Oh, okay. I think we're done. Oh, I want to say next month our program will be on leadership. I'll send you more information on it shortly. Hope to see most of you there, and have a lovely evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Marcelo, you're getting lots of thank yous.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you for, letting me speak. And,
Oh,
good
we
luck,
now
everyone.
have 4 new messages. Oh, lots of thank yous.
Yep,
Yeah.
lots of thank yous.
Okay. Great.
Good night.
Good night.